Hello, thank you. Thank you for coming. I want to also thank Zoe Pleckety and Philip Casey for their hard and tireless work. I'm honored to work at a school that supports this kind of student intervention. So you may have noticed that as I was speaking, there were these strange diagrams happening behind me and above my head. This is called sentence diagramming. It was developed in 1877 by two professors at the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, Alonzo Reed and Brainerd Kellogg. And it became something that was taught widely in American schools for a while. The principles are simple. There's a line representing the sentence, and then it is crossed with a line denoting subject and predicate. And I want to take you through a quick demonstration of how sentence diagramming works. I mentioned that I'm a teacher here. I teach 9th and 10th grade, and I asked my 10th graders for help with a sentence that I could diagram for you. So, Max, Luke, this one's for you. The sentence is, the student drove the Volkswagen recklessly. I teach 10th grade. Student, as the subject, belongs on the line, as nouns do, go on the horizontal lines. The verb comes after. The entire predicate comes after, but in this case, we want simply the verb. Then there's a line to denote a direct object, which we have in this case in Volkswagen. Any modifying words go on diagonal lines, whether those are articles, other kinds of adjectives, adverbs, prepositional or verbal phrases. And so then we diagram the articles in as the and Volkswagen. And finally, the adverb recklessly modifies drove. And so it helps us to see where all of these pieces work together. The Volkswagen is not reckless, the driving is reckless. But the Volkswagen is, of course, the most important part. Eventually, a complex sentence, as complex as the English language can get, can look something like this. It's really cool. Sentence diagramming speaks, I think, to a natural human desire, which is to take things apart. And if you need evidence of this, I ask you to simply think about handing a human being an Oreo. Only a monster eats an Oreo without taking it apart first. I guess that this probably goes back to early human needing to figure out if something is edible or not. Hey, this rock, can't take it apart, not edible. Cookie with yummy filling center. Good, we'll eat that. Despite it being a natural human tendency, sentence diagramming itself is a uniquely American phenomenon. The first sort of foray into this sort of diagramming was by S.W. Clark in 1847, and he wrote an impressive tome called A Practical Grammar, in which words, phrases, and sentences are classified according to their offices and their relation to each other, illustrated by a complete system of diagrams, which gives any other book title a run for its money. But he used a system of bubbles, and it became sort of confusing the way that those mushed together. And so in 1877, the professors at Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute refined that into the system of lines that you saw earlier. The idea of system diagramming became a pedagogical fad. It was taught into the 20th century. It was all the rage. But as is the case for any successful pedagogical tool, the usefulness of the Reed-Kellogg diagramming system was challenged. And by the 1960s, it was being called into question as an effective means of teaching. By 1985, the National Council of Teachers of English declared that repetitive grammar drills and exercises, like diagramming sentences, are a deterrent to the improvement of students' speaking and writing. But of course, anything anything that is rote becomes ineffective as a tool. The fault lies not in the tool, but in the way that it's applied. In one sense, taking apart the larger whole is functional. About a year ago, I bought a used new-to-me car, and after about a month, it stopped working. It wouldn't start, nothing. No lights, no indicator lights, just wouldn't turn over, none of the above. So I popped the hood, sometimes here in the parking lot, and found that there was a nut that wasn't connecting well to the battery. So I replaced it. It was great. And then it would happen again a couple of days later. After this had happened 5 or 6 times, I realized I really just needed to call an expert. So I called my dad. Now, my dad is an environmental engineer, which is like a mechanic. But he was able to pull out some wires and some tools and do a few things, and voila, it worked. And we were both pleased that we had been able to take something apart in order to make it functional. Of course, the side note is, about a year later, when the battery gave out altogether and I took it in for it to be replaced, we found out that I had been sold the car with the wrong battery. So it didn't even belong in my car. So sentence diagrams are not only a way to do the pieces of, as Kellogg and Alonzo Reed said, to pull apart pieces of sentences and understanding grammar, they're a way to discover the meaning of language in the way that it's used. So I want to give you some examples of how, beyond the rote understanding of sentence diagramming, we can discover some meaning when we do this. The first example I am going to give you is the first line of Moby Dick by Herman Melville. "Call me Ishmael." Many of us are familiar with this quote, but it's only when you diagram it and see the you, which is understood in an imperative verb, call me Ishmael, you, call me Ishmael, that we begin to see that not only does Melville use this structure because Ishmael is the only survivor of this incredible long journey, but because he's inviting us into this story as well. In Kindred by Octavia Butler, the first line is, "I lost an arm on my last trip home." Without giving too much away, Kindred is about an African-American woman in the 1970s who somehow, and she never quite figures that out, is transported back to a slave plantation. And she goes back and forth in time quite often, until she has an existence in both realities. And so to say that she lost an arm is one thing, but if you notice when we diagram, on my last trip home has this huge cluster modifying lost. And so we are aware that she is dealing with this identity, a multiple identity, and trying to resolve that in herself. Finally, the first line of The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, "We slept in what had once been the gymnasium." And when you diagram this, you notice that the main part of the sentence is, we slept. The Handmaid's Tale is, of course, a feminist dystopian cautionary story about a future in which patriarchal tendencies have run rampant. And so the idea that we slept, that we let this happen, that we were not aware of what was going on, becomes the focus when you can see it diagrammed and all of the other information put at a later time. Even modern journalists have recognized sentence diagramming as a way to dissect and understand a complex set of data. It is essentially information design, which allows us to distill data down into a finite form so as to see, or into finite tiers so as to see a larger form. Now, it's still possible to take that too far, and that's when we get things like deconstructed Caesar salads or deconstructed lemon meringue pies. It's actually, deconstruction was a philosophy not discovered by, but developed by Jacques Derrida, who used deconstruction to approach the relationship between text and meaning. So while sentence diagramming focuses on pulling the pieces apart in order to understand how they function in relation to one another, Derrida focused on pulling ideas apart in order to examine the assumptions in which those individual ideas are based. Derrida was born in French-occupied Algiers in 1930 to a Jewish family, and his entire career would be spent navigating the tensions of living in all of those worlds. He was influenced by former philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as well as his more contemporary academics such as Foucault, Proust, and Heidegger. The idea of deconstruction complemented those philosophers as they were developing post-structuralism and postmodernism. Derrida's book of grammatology is actually more of a philosophical treatise, but it was brought into the English language as a literary theory. And so those of us who teach English were familiar with this idea of deconstruction in our own literature classes. Derrida's prime motivation, however, was a political one. He wanted to deconstruct the power of regimes, particularly those that were not open to immigrants. He was suspect also of the institutions which fueled those regimes, which were the driving engines behind it. So he wrote, the idea behind deconstruction is to deconstruct the rhetoric of nationalism, the politics of place, the metaphysics of native land and native tongue. His focus was political and demanded intentional dissection of the underlying understandings and institutional assumptions. Philosophy is an incredible playground for the brain, but of course at some point we have to live in the real world and understand why any of this, beyond academia, has real-world applications. And so I have a personal short story to share with you about that. In 2004, I met the woman who would become my best friend forever and ever. We had both had our first children, who are coincidentally this year's freshman class. She lives in DC. There were so many similarities between us, so very many, but one. She's a registered Republican. I'm not. And so although we've been best friends for 14 years, every presidential election has tested our friendship to its limits. During the 2008 presidential campaign, Barack Obama and John McCain, we had a particularly emotional discussion, and she shared with me how much she was dreading a certain outcome of that election. And I felt as though I was falling into a deep hole. How could this person, whom I loved so much, with whom I was so close, be in opposition to the result that I was wanting? She was afraid of one choice, one option, and I was very afraid of the other. We had to learn to navigate that system, much as in our current political system, in our current society, we are so polarized on a variety of topics. How is there any conversation between that? Finally, we picked a time. We were at Sundance Film Festival one year, and we were sitting and we said, okay, we're going to get through abortion. We're going to talk about this political platform. We're going to make it happen. Being mathematically minded, Gretchen said, let's start with the assumptions. Let's start with the language. And so we didn't go into the platform itself or the actual subject. We started with questions about the rhetoric. Is pro-life the same as pro-abortion? Or pro-choice the same as pro-life the same as anti-abortion? Or pro-choice the same as pro-abortion? At what point is the issue a legal one? At what point is it a moral one? Is being anti-death penalty and anti-abortion a package deal, or can one be understood without the other? In a sense, we were diagramming the rhetoric of the issue rather than the grammatical structures, but the principle was the same. We were pulling apart the whole in order to examine the assumptions and put together a richer understanding in which we could both participate. We knew from the beginning that we would never change each other's minds. That was not even our goal. But what we did was organize our thoughts and develop meaning in a way that we could truly know and hear each other. It was in the deconstruction of that issue and in this friendship that we were able to construct the bridges between us. Thank you.